All right, here we go. G'day, ladies and gentlemen. Chad here. Welcome to another weekly tutorial as we endeavour to read through the Bible story in a year and to do so to the best of our ability in a chronological fashion. This is week number 32. Woof! 20 more to go. All right, so we're almost there, but we've come a long way, all right? We've seen a big journey of God's people, and we're about to see some very significant things happen over the next couple of weeks. Basically, where we're at in the story is that King Josiah is on the throne in Jerusalem. He reigns there for 30 years, all right? And this is about 300 years since King Solomon has died. So King Josiah is king number 16. And about 100 years ago, the northern kingdom of Israel, you remember, was taken away by the Assyrians because they broke covenant with God. And God said, if you don't do what I tell you, I'm going to come out against you. And he did that by using the Assyrian army. Well, Jerusalem are still doing well. In fact, under King Josiah, they're doing very well. However, as a general rule, they have not learned the lessons that the northern kingdom basically should have taught them. They have also worshipped God with terrible idolatry from previous kings. And so even though they have a good king now, their time is almost up. And the same thing that happened pretty well to their brothers in the north is going to happen to them very, very soon. And this is where we come to this week's readings of the prophets Zephaniah and Jeremiah. Very similar, prophesy, of course, at the same period of time. And we're going to be reading them this week. So first of all, Zephaniah. Very simple, 3 chapters, easy. You do it in one sitting, all right? And by now, you're very used to how the prophets work. Basically, it's a whole lot of doom and gloom with a little bit of hope thrown in at the end. Zephaniah is prophesies to a whole bunch of nations around Jerusalem, but his main focus is Judah and Jerusalem. And basically, he says to them right from the word go, listen, God's hand is against you and destruction is on its way. There's no two ways about it, all right? And basically, like Amos and Isaiah before him, Zephaniah uses the phrase, the day of the Lord. This destruction that's going to come upon them by the Babylonian army, which I don't think he names, you can look that up, but it's called the day of the Lord. It's basically the day of their destruction. He says that all the land will be laid desolate, all the land will be laid wasted and swept away, which is language very, very similar to Noah's flood, incidentally. And just take note again this week, depending on your translation, some translations say all the land will be laid waste, like the King James and literal versions. Some versions, though, say all the earth will be laid waste. Now, don't think if your version says the earth that it means he's prophesying against planet Earth, all right? He's not. He is prophesying against the world of Israel. Their land, where they are living, will be swept away and annihilated and destroyed. That is the prophetic language that's coming out of Zephaniah. And of course, as I said before, his prophecy ends with a bit of hope. The last chapter has this beautiful moment where he says, listen, that righteous remnant will one day return. Okay, so it's not totally over. And at that time, he says, the Lord will rejoice over you with singing. It's just a beautiful, beautiful passage, right? So that's Zephaniah. Easy. You can do that in about 20 minutes, really, get that book done. Then we come this week to the book of Jeremiah. 52 chapters all up. We're reading the first 22 chapters this week, which is about 95% doom and gloom, all right? So it's a bit depressing. Good luck, okay? But Jeremiah is called the weeping prophet. He's an emotional guy. That's just how he is. I'll mention a little bit about that in a moment. But Jeremiah is a really, really key prophet. He's also based in Jerusalem and Judea. He's from a priestly family, so he has quite a bit of respect about him. And he prophesies for a period of, get this, 40 years. So again, while King Josiah is ruling, the king I mentioned right at the start, King Josiah, right there from all the way through to the point where Jerusalem is destroyed by the Babylonians. He was there. He knew that was coming and he saw that happening. Jeremiah prophesies for 40 years, which is significant, as I'll mention in a moment. 3 things that stood out to me and 3 things you need to, I think, pay attention to as we read Jeremiah this week. Number 1, Jeremiah is ministering at a time where God very clearly has made up his mind about Jerusalem and their impending fall. This is now the 3rd or 4th prophet that has said Jerusalem will fall, and God has most certainly made up his mind. In fact, there are times where Jeremiah wants to pray for Jerusalem, and God said, don't bother. Don't bother praying, mate. Don't bother praying. I know I've relented in the past, but for this stiff-necked generation, is what he calls them, I will not relent. He said, even if Moses or Samuel prays to me, I will not change my mind. The destruction that I've declared against Jerusalem is on its way. I'm determined to do them harm. And of course, how is God going to do this? How is God going to cast them from his presence, which is what he says again this week? Well, he's going to do the same thing, basically, that he did with Israel in the north. A foreign nation, the Babylonians, are going to come in. They're going to lay siege to the city. Jeremiah spells all this out. They're going to lay siege to the city. Those who escape will be carried off into exile as prisoners, but those who remain in the city will die of the sword, they will die of plague, or they will die of starvation. And he even says, what we heard Moses say years ago, that the starvation will be so bad, people will even eat their own children. And remember, we saw that happen with Samaria when they were under siege once. So just terrible, terrible things that are going to happen during this Babylonian war. And so Jeremiah is told, the point is this, God's made up his mind. This is going to happen. Jeremiah, don't even bother praying for them. And he even says this. He says, Jeremiah, don't even bother getting married or having kids, because this is going to happen to this generation. It'll happen in your lifetime. This disaster is coming. It's not one day in the future. It's now. So don't marry. Don't have kids. It is not the time for that. This destruction is going to take place in this generation. And of course, that's one of the significant things, I think, about Jeremiah's prophetic ministry lasting 40 years, because 40 is a picture of what a generation is. When Moses was in the desert, it was 40 years. God said that whole generation has to die. Well, similar thing here. Jeremiah prophesies for 40 years because it is a sign that it is this generation that's going to experience this destruction. So the first point is God has made up his mind. That is very certain and comes across over and over and over again in the readings. The second thing is this. I want you to pay attention, as always, to the way that Jeremiah draws on the ministry of previous prophets. All right? He uses language very similar to Isaiah. I think he actually probably knew about Isaiah's prophecy. He talks about unquenchable fire and the land being laid waste and becoming a haunt for jackals. I mean, these are very specific terms that Isaiah used. He talks about Israel, or Judah, of course, being God's wife. All right? And when she worshipped other gods, it was like her committing adultery on him. Now listen, that's straight out of Hosea. Remember the guy Hosea who was up in the north and he married an adulterous woman? Okay, he draws on that picture. In fact, Jeremiah this week says that these two kingdoms, when they coexisted, were like two sisters. Both of them married to God, and God divorced the northern tribe when he destroyed her. So Jeremiah is sharing that same language that he gets from Hosea. He also uses language, sorry, there's a plane going overhead. He also uses language from Moses, which almost all the prophets do. It's amazing. When he talks about Jerusalem being destroyed, he uses reverse creation language. He says basically the land is going to go back to a place where it is formless and void and the heavens have no light. All right? It is exactly the same words used in the first 3 verses of the Bible, just like God created his world, okay? With the heavens and the earth, gave light. It was formless and void, but he gave it form. So Jeremiah says that is going to, when God destroys Judah, it's like the opposite's going to happen here. It says he's going to fight against them with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, which is basically quoting what Moses said about Egypt. What God did to Egypt, God is now going to do to Judah. And he says, but, there is hope, okay, but, like clay in a potter's hand, when the potter's not happy with what's happening and he destroys it, he then recreates something new and has a new beginning. And that is a beautiful picture that echoes the language of Noah. I looked up the Hebrew words. It's the same. He says when he destroys, when it was corrupt and he destroys the clay, he recreates something. It's the same word used about Noah's flood. All right, so 2 things. Number 1, this disaster is sealed. It's a done deal. God's not going to change his mind. Number 2, watch how Jeremiah draws on other prophets' language. He's very well aware of the other prophets in their ministry. And finally, and far more personally, one thing I noticed this week, Notice the individuality of Jeremiah. He is a very emotional man. He reminded me a bit like David. He's a creative guy and he wears his heart on his sleeve. And so as he prophesies, God actually gets him to use pictures like a belt and a potter's clay. Why? Because Jeremiah's a creative guy. And God wants Jeremiah to speak to Jeremiah in the way that he understands. He is a man, he's called the weeping prophet. He wears his heart on his sleeve. And there's over and over again, you'll see instances where Jeremiah cries out to God, because of his own turmoil or because of the stuff he's hearing. He's quite emotional. And this is where Jeremiah, I noticed, uses the word heart a lot. Take note of how many times he uses the word heart. He often speaks of Israel's stubborn heart. Like no other prophet that we've seen so far. He talks about the stubbornness of their heart. He introduces us to the idea that it's not just important to be physically circumcised, but to have their hearts circumcised. That's not a New Testament concept. Jeremiah came up with that because he was talking about their hearts. He said the way that they worship idols is like they've got the love of those idols written on the tablets of their hearts, engraved on their hearts. He says the Lord searches your heart. It is evil. Who can possibly help or cure it? All right. So he often talks about their heart. And of course, all this is because God has a heart. The reason we have a heart, the reason Israel had a heart, is because God has a heart. His people are his beloved bride that he loves. And when they prostituted themselves and worshipped other gods, God's heart broke for them. And so I think this whole heart thing really comes out in Jeremiah this week. Notice that, to me, I think it's really important and it highlights his individuality. All right, so Jeremiah, it's a big book, but we're going to get through it in about 3 weeks. It's a mix of narrative and poetry, and you'll see that as you go. Basically, this week's readings end with the siege against Jerusalem from Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar. The siege begins, and basically it's all downhill from there. All right, but keep going. All right, it'll all work out fine in the end. Next week we're going to finish Kings and Chronicles, and really proud of you for making it this far. 12-minute video, guys. Enjoy your readings. I'll see you on the other side. Bless you heaps. Where's my stop button? All right, bye.